Hi everyone. In the final episode of Better Call Saul, we see a flashback from when Mike and Jimmy were in the desert. After finally finding water, Jimmy suggests why they don't just split the $7 million they have and go their separate ways. Mike tells Jimmy they wouldn't be able to get away with it, to which Jimmy says they could if they had a time machine. They then discuss what they would change in their lives if they did have a time machine. Mike initially says he would go back to 2001. This is likely just before his son was killed by the two corrupt police officers. He then changes his mind and says he would go back to 1984 when he took his first bribe. Jimmy says he would go back to 1965 and invest in Warren Buffett's company Berkshire Hathaway, and how he would have become a billionaire or even trillionaire by doing this. Mike is surprised that Jimmy is only concerned by money and doesn't consider any personal events in his life. We then continue from where we left off in the last episode, with Gene on the run. Gene is surrounded from both sides, and there's even a police helicopter searching for him. He hides in the garbage, desperately trying to open a burner phone and call Ed the Disappearer in hope of once again getting a new identity. While opening the packaging for the phone, it falls and Gene is unable to find it. Soon after that, the police find Gene in the garbage and he is arrested. With his identity now being revealed, Jimmy shaves his mustache, which was the main distinctive feature of his Gene persona. Jimmy calls his old friend Bill Oakley and wants him to be an advisory counsel to him. Oakley and Jimmy try to make a plea deal to reduce Jimmy's sentence. On his way into the detention center, he sees Hank's widow, Marie. Jimmy then requests that Marie be let into the room. Marie partly blames him for her husband's death, as he helped Walt become the criminal he became. Jimmy tells Marie about how he was kidnapped by Walt and had a gun pointed to his head in front of an open grave which Walt had dug. He describes this as being his introduction to Walter White. He proceeds to mention how he only helped Walt because he was afraid Walt would kill him if he didn't comply. He mentions the prisoners Walt had killed in the space of 2 minutes, and how this only added to his fear. The lead prosecutor, George Castellano, has never lost a case, and Jimmy reminds him that just one juror going in Jimmy's favor could end this flawless record. Jimmy manages to sweet-talk his way into a very favorable deal, which will see him only do 7.5 years in jail. Feeling confident after reducing his sentence from the initial 30 years, Jimmy demands he serve his term at a low-security prison in North Carolina, which has a golf program. He mentions how he wouldn't want to end up in a hellhole like ADX Montrose, which he is familiar with as he once visited a client there. At this point, Jimmy is enjoying himself and wants to know just how far he can push the prosecution. He makes a demand to have a pint of Bluebell mint chocolate chip ice cream every Friday, to which they struggle to believe at first, but agree to. Just as they get ready to leave the room, Jimmy thinks he has one more card up his sleeve, and says he will reveal the truth of what happened to a prominent New Mexico lawyer. Before he even manages to say his name, the prosecution know this is Howard Hamlin and reveal that Kim admitted everything to the Albuquerque district attorney. Jimmy is completely shocked by this and doesn't have a response. We then witness another flashback where Walt and Jimmy are both in limbo while waiting to be given their new identities. Walt is agitated by a clicking noise. Jimmy then tells Walt what he would do if he had a time machine. At first, Walt is mystified by this question, but understands that Jimmy is actually asking what regrets he has in his life. Walt tells Jimmy about gray matter technologies and how Elliot and Gretchen grew a billion-dollar company on the foundations of his work. He regrets that he left, and says doing so is one of the reasons why he's in the situation he's in now. Jimmy is somewhat frustrated that Walt never told him about this. He says that he could have helped Walt solve this, to which Walt replies by saying he would have been the last lawyer he would have gone to. When Walt asks Jimmy about his regrets, the same way he did with Mike, Jimmy again mentions something which is not deeply personal to him. He refers to a slip and fall scam he did, in which he actually injured his knees permanently. Walt then comments on how Jimmy has always been the way he is. Jimmy is then on a flight on his way to court and tells Oakley what will happen to Kim. Oakley reveals that Kim admitted everything to Howard's widow, Cheryl, and that Cheryl intends to sue Kim for everything she has. Jimmy then instructs Oakley that he has more testimony to give on Howard's death and that it involves Kim. We then see that Kim has decided to volunteer at Central Florida Legal Aid. She receives a call from her old colleague at the courthouse, Suzanne Erickson, who tells her that Jimmy has been arrested and is going to give testimony that affects her, which results in her being at the trial. What follows is Jimmy walking into the courtroom in a suit which is reminiscent of Saul Goodman at his peak. The judge is surprised at just how good the plea deal is for Jimmy and is confused at how they reached this decision. Jimmy is eager to speak and interrupts the prosecution's statement. The judge tells Jimmy that this is the most generous sentencing recommendation she has seen in her career, and that any statement he makes is likely to make things worse for him. Jimmy acknowledges this and insists he be able to speak, to which the judge agrees. At first, Jimmy says the same thing he said at the plea meeting about how being captured and forced to kneel in front of an open grave at gunpoint was his introduction to Walter White. What he says next, however, is very unexpected. Jimmy says he wasn't terrified for long, as he saw the opportunity he now had and the money he could make by helping Walt. He goes as far as saying how every waking moment was spent helping build Walt's drug empire. We see Oakley looking confused as to what Jimmy is hoping to achieve by doing this. The judge tells Jimmy to consult Oakley before he says another word, as he is going against what was said in their plea agreement. Oakley, now trying to save face, tells the judge he wants to be withdrawn from the case, to which the judge says there's not a chance. Jimmy then looks back at Kim, who has a blank expression on her face. He then says how he lied about Kim being involved in Howard's death, because he just wanted her to be there and hear what he was going to say. He then goes on to further incriminate himself by saying how he laundered Walt's money and lied for Walt, all while he was making millions. He says that Walt couldn't have done it without him, and that Hank and Steve Gomez may still be alive if it wasn't for him helping Walt. He admitted to knowing about all the bad things he was doing, such as the murders, but chose to ignore it. He believes that Walt would have either been killed or in prison without him. Jimmy then looks back at Kim, who still has an emotionless expression on her face, and Jimmy looks saddened by this. As a result, he then demands to speak again, in which he almost tears up while trying to talk about Howard's death. He says how Kim is the one who had the guts to start over in Florida, but he was the one who ran away, most likely referencing himself, fully embracing his Saul Goodman persona as an escape from what happened. Jimmy then mentions Chuck's death, and for the first time admits the part he played in getting Chuck's malpractice insurance cancelled, which led to Chuck committing suicide. The judge tells him to sit down, addressing him as Mr. Goodman. Jimmy finally frees himself of his Saul Goodman persona and tells the judge his name is James McGill. He then looks back at Kim a final time, in which she looks a lot more calm and has a much more relaxed facial expression. We then see a final flashback with Jimmy and Chuck, where Jimmy has brought back some groceries for Chuck due to Chuck's electromagnetic hypersensitivity, meaning he can't go to the store himself. Chuck says Jimmy shouldn't trouble himself by doing this, and he can just hire someone from the office. Jimmy says Chuck would do the same for him. Chuck wants Jimmy to stay and tries to make conversation. He asks Jimmy about his clients, to which Jimmy is surprised as he thinks Chuck just wants to tell him what he's doing wrong. Chuck gives Jimmy some advice and tells him if he doesn't like where he's heading, there's no shame in going back and changing your path. Jimmy seems defensive and asks Chuck when he's ever changed his path. Chuck is somewhat frustrated by this response and tells Jimmy how they always end up having the same conversation. We then see Chuck pick up a book called The Time Machine. We now see Jimmy on a bus being taken to the prison. The prison he's going to is the one he specifically mentioned he didn't want to go to in his plea meeting, ADX Montrose. Other prisoners recognize him as Saul on the prison bus and break out into a chant of Better Call Saul. We see Jimmy cooking in the prison kitchen, which would be a familiar setting from when he managed the Cinnabon as Gene Takovic. Jimmy then is visited by Kim, who is posing as a lawyer, and is able to gain entry as her New Mexico Bar Association card still works and doesn't have an expiry date. Jimmy is relatively surprised to see her, and the two share a cigarette. We see a glimpse of colour while the cigarette is being lit, which is the second and final time we see colour in the present timeline. Kim is surprised that Jimmy had his sentence down to 7 years, but we learn that after his confessions, he was sentenced to 86 years in jail. He jokes that with good behaviour, who knows? Kim then leaves, looking at Jimmy, who gives her the pointed gun gesture. Kim looks back at him one last time, and this scene brings an end to the Breaking Bad universe. We see that Gene ends up hiding in the garbage can to avoid the police. This scene is similar to when Jimmy tries to find the shredded Sandpiper documents in the garbage way back in Season 1. At that time, he was trying to make his brother proud by hoping to start a class action lawsuit. Jimmy wanted Chuck to respect him as a lawyer, but even after going to the lengths he did, spending hours piecing together shredded documents, Chuck still went out of his way to stop Jimmy ever working in his law firm. Chuck could never accept Jimmy as being a lawyer, even criticizing his law degree from the University of American Samoa as being a joke. He couldn't appreciate the fact Jimmy secretly put himself through law school and passed the bar exam to gain Chuck's respect. Chuck claims that he worked extremely hard to become a lawyer, and Jimmy just took a load of shortcuts, and now Jimmy is suddenly meant to be his equal. Chuck refuses to believe Jimmy will ever change from his slipping Jimmy nature, and mentions how slipping Jimmy having a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun. This conversation basically destroyed their relationship and made Jimmy lose all emotion for his brother. Do you think Jimmy would have falsified the Mesa Verde documents or got Chuck's malpractice insurance cancelled if Chuck had just accepted him as a lawyer? If Chuck had let Jimmy work at HHM, I believe Jimmy would have been a much more stable and happier individual. He wouldn't have ever needed to fall further and further into his Saul persona and take the risks he did. I think Chuck would also still be alive, as Jimmy would have still cared deeply for him. This moment is one of the most important in the whole series, and the fact that Chuck, even with his condition, used a phone and called Howard just proves how strongly he was against Jimmy being a lawyer. Jimmy even mentions how using that phone must have felt like a blowtorch in Chuck's ear. Chuck refused to believe Jimmy could ever change. I think if Chuck had been more supportive of Jimmy's law career, Jimmy could have changed and become a legitimate lawyer. Because of what Chuck said, Jimmy was never able to escape from the slipping Jimmy mentality and kept getting dragged down further and further until he lost everything and ultimately led to his imprisonment. Chuck was obviously very passionate about the law and viewed it as sacred. He couldn't understand how someone with such a shady past, such as Jimmy, could enter his profession. In Jimmy's flashback, we see Chuck picking up the book titled The Time Machine. After Jimmy was imprisoned, if somebody asked him now about his regrets, he likely would have wanted to go back to that moment with Chuck. Chuck even told Jimmy he can change the path he was on. Perhaps Jimmy regrets how he left things with Chuck, and might wish he didn't let Chuck's opinion of him affect him so much. He clearly has some regret for exaggerating Chuck's condition so he would lose his malpractice insurance, as this is what led to Chuck killing himself. Chuck's whole life was dedicated to the law, and to have that taken away from him was just simply a life he could not live. Jimmy even let Howard blame himself for Chuck's death, and the two men will never know that Jimmy was the reason why Chuck's malpractice insurance became an issue. Jimmy, looking back, might also regret not taking up Howard's job offer at HHM, but by that point, Jimmy was past the point of no return and was fully invested in his Saul Goodman persona. If Jimmy did work at HHM, it's almost certain he wouldn't have involved himself with dangerous individuals such as Lalo or Walt. He wouldn't have become a cartel lawyer and witnessed what happened in the desert or Howard's death. These events are what cost Jimmy his freedom and what lost him everything. Even after Chuck's death, Jimmy still had Kim, and part of who he truly was still existed. The issue with their relationship was that Jimmy brought out the worst in Kim and made her even more crooked than him. When Jimmy called Kim to tell her to abandon their plan against Howard, she was the one who insisted strongly they see it through. Kim had the opportunity of a lifetime to go to that meeting and fulfill her dream of having her own law practice, defending those who need a voice. In that moment, the decision she made to go back and execute their plan against Howard didn't just ruin her life, but it led Jimmy down the dark path he went, which resulted in his 86-year imprisonment. It's clear that Jimmy believed that the information he had about Howard's death would have helped him reduce his sentence even further, to only just a few years perhaps. But when he realizes that Kim had come clean, I believe in this moment his Saul Goodman persona dies, and he decides that he too will come clean about everything he has done. Jimmy tells Oakley on the plane that he has more information about Howard's death which involves Kim. He says this in a very bitter way by saying, "You don't understand, it's really good ice cream." Him saying this made me think for a second he might really want to cause problems for Kim. Kim would have also likely feared the worst, considering how things were left after the phone call and the resulting breakdown she had on the bus. Her volunteering at Central Florida Legal Aid is likely her attempt to get back some of what made her who she was when she was at her peak as a lawyer. After receiving the call from Erickson, she likely feared the worst and was worried about what Jimmy could say. We see that she looks nervous in the courtroom as she is tapping her feet. In this episode, we witness how Gene evolved back into Saul and then back into who he truly is, Jimmy McGill. Gene was like a shadow of Saul. He still had the same reckless mentality deep down, but was much more cautious and lived under constant fear of being recognized. We see Saul at his peak when he is trying to reduce his sentence and when he tells Oakley that he will always end up on top. Finally, after realizing Kim confessed everything, he too can finally come to terms with all that's happened and free himself of Saul, hence the name of the episode, Saul Gone. He even goes as far as correcting people who address him as Saul, like we saw in the scene at the bus and in the courtroom. In the courtroom, he kept looking back at Kim until finally he saw a more relaxed expression on her face, and at this point he was able to accept the consequences of his actions. I enjoyed seeing Bill Oakley in this episode, as his presence provided a few humorous moments. His reaction to Saul starting to admit his crimes and the way he turned his head was quite funny. Oakley trying to withdraw from the case and being strongly denied was also very amusing. Him trying to justify how Jimmy's confession was just a single point of view that had no evidence was also very amusing. As soon as Jimmy realized Kim had admitted everything, he decided he was going to come clean and so just strung along Oakley, likely for his own amusement. I believe that Jimmy will have no problems adapting to prison life. The prisoners view him almost like a celebrity from his commercials, and him knowing that Kim is happy and everything is out in the open is closure for him. He will likely enjoy his role in the prison kitchen from his experience in Cinnabon. Being surrounded by dangerous people is nothing new to Jimmy at this point. In fact, it's a familiar setting for him. In a strange way, it's a somewhat positive ending for the character, and it seems he has accepted that he will spend the rest of his life in jail, and he is fine with that. At least he no longer has to hide behind a persona and can just be himself. Everything being out in the open will also likely allow Kim to get on with her life and try to gain some of the confidence she used to have. I thought this was a great ending, as Kim and Jimmy don't have to live in the shadows anymore and can try to just get on with life, free from worry or concern. It has been a long and emotional journey with these characters, and this is now likely the last we will see from this universe and its characters. I would say this ending was a fitting conclusion to the Breaking Bad universe and a great way to end it, especially the fact it ended in the courtroom, which is the heart of what Better Call Saul is all about. See you next week for another Better Call Saul video. Please like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.